All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Alexis Carlson, and I am a project manager with the Northwest Mhttc. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. Ashley Stewart today for her presentation with Equity, Recovery, and Resilience. I would like to say just a few words about the Mhttc network and go through a few housekeeping things, and then I will turn the presentation over to her. So the Mhttc network is a nationwide network, and it is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The network aims to disseminate and implement evidence-based practices for mental health issues into the workforce. The goals of the network include supporting evidence-based practices for mental health, heightening the awareness, skills, and knowledge of the workforce, fostering regional and national alliances, and providing and connecting you to free training and technical assistance. The Northwest Mhttc is one of 10 centers. We're based in Seattle at the University of Washington, and we provide our services to Region 10, which includes Idaho, Oregon, Alaska, and Washington. Our area of focus is on evidence-based activities for serious mental health issues such as psychosis. We also provide training on a variety of topics, including integrated care, suicide prevention, diversity and equity issues, school mental health, peer support, trauma-informed approaches, and others. The target workforce that we serve includes behavioral health and primary care providers, school and social services staff, and then others whose work has the potential to improve behavioral health outcomes for individuals either at risk of developing serious mental illness or those who are currently experiencing that. We fulfill our mission through a variety of activities. We have live events like this webinar that we record and post to our website. We offer virtual learning communities. We have free self-paced online courses. We send out regular newsletters. We have a resource library on our website, and we also connect you with the other regional training centers and the events that they offer. To find out more about our goals and the training opportunities, please be sure to visit our website and sign up for the newsletter. This is our land acknowledgement. It states the Northwest Mhttc honors the many cultures and lands across our region, spanning Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. We want to acknowledge that the Northwest Mhttc, based in Seattle, sits on the traditional land of the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded the land across the generations. It's important to us at Northwest Mhttc to use affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language. We encourage all clinicians to do the same. This language helps demonstrate respect for a person's dignity and worth, and it's consistent with recovery-oriented practices. A little bit of housekeeping. Everyone today is muted with your video off. We are recording this so that we can post the recording and the slides to our website later. And by attending today, you will receive a certificate of attendance, but we are not able to offer formal CEUs for this event. We have both the chat and the Q&A feature. Anything you submit in the chat will be seen by our staff and by the other attendees. You can use the chat to say hi. If you have any technical assistance, you can alert our staff by using the chat. And then for the Q&A, please use the Q&A for those content-focused questions. We'll save some time here at the end of the presentation for Dr. Stewart to be able to answer questions that you submit through the Q&A. And if we're not able to get to that during the presentation, we can also follow up with you afterwards today. Finally, there will be an evaluation. We ask that you be able to do this because the feedback definitely helps us understand our activities, and we can use this information also to report back to SAMHSA on what we do. So the link for that evaluation will be sent in the chat today, and you'll also receive a reminder email tomorrow. Your feedback definitely helps us plan future sessions, so please take a few minutes to do that. Our disclaimer simply says that SAMHSA sponsors this event, but does not take any official stance on it. And so with all of that housekeeping and introduction, now on to the best part of today. I'd like to welcome Dr. Ashley Stewart. She's an adjunct expert, trainer, and curriculum development specialist at C4 Innovations. She received her PhD from the Ohio State University College of Social Work and her master's at Columbia University. She's an assistant professor at Temple University College of Public Health, School of Social Work, and does training with interdisciplinary students about social justice theories and frameworks and translational skills for anti-oppressive practice. She provides racial equity training, consultation, and support, and understands and respects the intricacies inherent in diversity and inclusion. Her research includes assessing the intersections of identity, structural oppression, health and mental health, and policy. In addition to the advanced study of the consequence and cause of identity-based oppression, she supports the implementation of anti-oppressive practices at organizational, structural, programmatic, and clinical interventions. So, Dr. Stewart, I'm very happy to welcome you today. Thank you so much, and we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. How are you? Listen, I see that some folks are sending things in the chat. I just want to let folks know that I welcome you to use the chat throughout the entire duration of this presentation. Just so that folks know, there's an option to send things to panelists or panelists and attendees. So if you want to send it to the whole group, just make sure that it says panelists and attendees. And if you just want it to come to me and the folks on the stage, you can send it to just to panelists. I hope that we can use this chat feature throughout the entirety of it. You don't have to wait till the end for Q&A. You can submit your questions through Q&A, but you can also use the chat as well. So I'm hoping we'll have a lively and engaged interaction through the chat. And so if you do have a question that you want to ask, but you don't want your name to be associated with it, you can also send it to panelists, and I'll be sure to read your question without reading your name. So excited to be here with y'all. Let me know in the chat, where are you joining from? Okay, DC, Illinois, Missouri, Maryland, Washington, California, Oregon, Ohio. Wonderful. I'm joining you from New Jersey, Mississippi, California, Illinois, Chicago in the house. I love it. I love it. Well, so glad that you are here in this space with me and that I get to spend this time with y'all. Today, our topic that we're going to be talking about is engaging in critical dialogue around equity, recovery, and resilience. And so I know that equity has been something that many of us have been talking about a whole lot recently. I know that it is something that is at the forefront of many of our hearts and minds. And so we're going to really get into the content of what equity means. So grateful to Alexis, who kindly shared that brief introduction about me, and a little bit about my racial equity and inclusion scholarship. I look at forms of institutionalized forms of identity-based oppression, right? And a cornerstone of looking at identity-based oppression, I also look at the intersectionality of it and examining that through the lens of race and racism in the US. And so I don't start any session that I'm talking about equities and issues around inequities without honoring and bringing light to the critical social issues that are on most of our hearts and minds as we engage in this conversation. Today, we're going to talk about forms of systemic and structural oppression. We're going to talk about equity. We're going to talk about inequities. We're going to talk about having difficult conversations. And so a really important part of this is to acknowledge that we're all coming to this space from different places, processing different things. Based on where you're located, you might be engaging in these types of conversations on a daily basis or not at all. So I just want to create an honoring space for that we can acknowledge the different systemic and structural issues that are at the foundation and so critically important to the topics we're talking about today. I also do training and curriculum. I get to work with a lot of amazing health organizations, national programming and organizations, corporations, universities. I love to teach, and that's a big part of what I do on a daily basis. I also teach courses on social justice advocacy, clinical interventions, anti-oppressive practice, power, race, oppression, and privilege. And then, of course, my work as a clinician was really based around race-based trauma, anxiety, depression, and allostatic load as it relates to compounding stress, particularly stress that is linked to identity-based oppressions. So that's a little bit about me, and that's kind of what brings me here and the why I'm so passionate about talking to folks today. All righty, move that over there. So the goals for our session today are to define equity and examine actionable steps towards inclusive practices. We're going to review briefly the relationships between equity and recovery. We only have a short amount of time together, so we'll get as much accomplished as we can. We're going to discuss barriers to talking about equity and recovery, and we'll have the opportunity to lean into and practice some authentic equity-focused conversations by reviewing some different skills that might be helpful in engaging and having these conversations moving forward. I am doing another session in the upcoming month that's going to dive more into looking at racial equity and inclusion. So if you're around for that one, it'll feel like we are continuing some parts of that part of our session goal for today as well. We're going to acknowledge in this session that systemically marginalized communities continue to demonstrate strength and resilience. And so this session is about taking accountability to pursue critical culture shift to reduce harm, starting with identifying the sources of oppression. Navigating in the space that we are all here, I certainly do hope to reduce the amount of harm that we cause. And in doing so, creating a space that allows for accountability for each of us to be able to engage with ourselves. And then starting critical conversations, examining self-awareness in the process. One of my favorite quotes to start this off with is that we cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge. Now that quote has been attributed to a few different folk. I'm pretty sure the first time I heard it, it was Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, but apparently Dr. Phil has said it once a few times as well. So regardless, it is a common phrase, but it's the one that sticks with me and is at the foundation of my work. We cannot challenge what we cannot acknowledge. And so this is a space of acknowledging. So let's just go ahead and get into it. If that sounds good, let me know. Tell me it sounds good in the chat, and and make sure that we're staying engaged. All righty, I love it. Some folks can't see it, but we got some let's goes and sound goods coming in the chat. Wonderful, thank you. So these are the requests that I do whenever I do sessions or trainings, but I include them today, not because these are requests that I ask for you all. Of course, yes, as we type in the chat, these are things to be mindful of, but I include them today because I think that they are actionable things that we can take away as we prepare to engage more critically in conversations and critical dialogue around equity, recovery, and resilience. That's what you came here for, right? So as I'm going through these lists of different requests, I want you to sit with them and I want you to think about how can these requests enhance, change, provide different opportunities for you to engage in critical dialogue around equity, recovery, and resilience. And after I go through these, I'm going to check in with folks and see, what things have been barriers for you in having these conversations before. So I want you to keep that in mind as I go through these requests. The first is to expect a lack of closure. Acknowledging that equity is an action and it requires a journey of unlearning things, a journey of challenging notions of things that we have come to normalize within society. And so after any sessions, there might not be a bow that's tied on to the topic. And that's actually the goal. We want to expect that there's not going to be closure, but that it's a journey and that we'll continue in this process. I like to think of this when I'm having a conversation and let folks know, hey, we're going to continue to uncover stuff about this topic. So let's give ourselves the grace to not expect that this can be a closed and done conversation, particularly when we're talking about equity. Asking for clarifications. We saw the many different places that folks are joining us from. And so that gives me some context to know that there may be geographical differences, but certainly there's lived experience differences when we're engaging with these conversations in professional spaces, but also in our personal lives. And so a phrase or a saying or something I say might be the way that I'm used to framing it, but maybe not a way that you or someone else is. So asking for clarification is a really important part in having conversations about equity, particularly critical dialogue. Embracing discomfort. Oh, wow. People don't like to be uncomfortable, and I get it. But when we're talking about equity, there's inevitably going to be some discomfort. In fact, I would say that once we start hitting the point where the conversation gets uncomfortable, we're actually starting to make some critical progress and beginning to shift and think about things differently. Discomfort is not always an indicator, particularly in equity conversations, that something's going astray. It actually might be an indicator that we are exactly where we need to be, that the things that have needed to have been said, that the shift in priority of narratives is happening. And that's where we come to embrace discomfort as an indicator that we're doing something right. When it comes to equity in recovery spaces, a lot of times we'll look at it as work for a particular task group, or this is work for this group of people or that group of people. And I remind us that this work is not for others. It's for all of us. It's for every single one of us in this space. And those who will be watching it later. This is the work for all of us. We want to be sure to honor all experiences and expertise equally. Both come in many forms. There are going to be people in this room who, as we talk about equity, this is going to sit with you very closely. You may have experienced these exact examples we'll review inequities in life. And your expertise, your narrative, your lived experiences is valued. It's important. And I'll actually jump to a couple notches down, which says to revoke expert experiences in positioning. Within the work that you do, you probably have a lot of moments where people look to you for response. And you have to have some sort of expert or automatic response to folk. We want to revoke that when we're having conversations about equity, because it's about listening and it's about being heard. And so if we are navigating from this expert positioning, it actually puts an unnecessary pressure on ourselves to have a swift comeback, to have something to respond to, instead of being in a space that gives ourselves grace to learn. And so I encourage us to revoke expert positioning when it comes to conversations about equity. I want to acknowledge the difference between safe space and brave space. Some spaces that'll feel safe to me might not feel safe to you all, but they might still be a brave space that we can both engage in. Talking about and addressing forms of systemic and structural oppression feels very safe to me. It's not going to feel safe to everybody. And that's okay. But together we can have a brave space to engage. Sometimes folks learning and me observing other folks learning doesn't necessarily feel like the safest space for me either. But being present in it can also have some benefit. So we want to acknowledge both safe and brave spaces. This one's my favorite. This tool for engaging in critical dialogue around equity is revisiting welcome. And what this means is that we're going to have this hour-long session today. And some of us are going to know exactly what we want to say, what we want to ask. We're going to hear something, we want to affirm it. We're going to put in the chat, oh my goodness, yes, Ashley, definitely. This is my experience. I've thought about this. You're going to be putting and engaging in the chat. And then some folks, you're going to sit with it for a little bit, and that's okay too. In fact, it might be at the end of the session that you'll want to respond to something on this slide. And it took you some time to process and get there, and then you want to share it. We have to acknowledge and honor that people process information differently and provide this opportunity for revisiting welcome. Because when it comes to equity, these things are very close and personal to us. And giving ourselves the grace to be able to revisit, to come back, to lean in more is always going to be important. We don't want folks to feel like, tag, I missed the chance to say that. I really wish I wouldn't. Revisiting's welcome. Let's come back to it. Let's continue to talk about it. And setting that standard before engaging in critical dialogue about equity is so important. Listen to understand. The goal isn't to agree. The goal is to seek to understand more, to get a critical perspective, to be deeply engaged, authentically engaged. And so a lot of times we listen to respond. I know I definitely do, right? Someone's saying something to me and I'm like, ooh, you know what that reminded me? As soon as they stop saying, I'm going to start to, how do we relinquish some of that pressure from ourselves to just listen to understand, even if that means forgetting what we're going to say for just a moment. Intent versus impact. A barrier that I typically see is that people are afraid of saying things because they don't want to cause harm. And that's a good reason to be cautious in conversations. But if we can just give ourselves the space to say, okay, if I'm imperfect, I can be accountable. I don't need to try to say, oh, I didn't mean that and minimize someone else's experience. I can be accountable. I can recognize that even though I intended for something to come off one way, it had a different impact, and I can be accountable to that impact that it had. And to be gentle with ourselves and to be gentle with others. And so I like to use this quote. This is the article from the Harvard Business Review on moving beyond diversity towards racial equity. And Ben Mhttc, who is the author, says, conflict is not only incidental, but it's required for transformation to occur and for it to be sustained. It has been said that conflict, from discomfort to active disagreement, is change trying to happen. So let's talk about it. Realizing that talking about equity is not always easy. What are some of the barriers that you experience when talking about oppression and inequities? I'm going to put a link in the chat here. If you look at that link, it's going to take you to a web browser. And that web browser, I'm going to stop sharing just so that folks can get a chance to look at that. And if you can't, it's okay. I'll read it off so that you'll know what the other folks in the room is saying. It's going to take you to a blank screen, and then the top of the screen is going to say barriers to conversations about inequities and oppression. And if you click anywhere on that screen, you can begin to write something. You don't have to put your name. You can just simply write out your thought. And I would like folks to join me in writing. What are some of the barriers that you have experienced to having conversations about inequities and oppression? Yeah, someone writes, you don't want to make someone else uncomfortable. Lack of trust in others or lack of trust in the process. Folks who are non-POC, non-people of color, getting offended and maybe even crying. And some would say centering their own experiences as opposed to being present to hear someone else's. Yeah. People being closed-minded. I see that someone is affirming, someone else wrote, feeling like I have nothing to say or add to the conversation. And someone likes that one. And that one's a really common one that I hear. Overcoming what I was taught as a child, someone shares. Fear of getting it wrong. Lack of trust. Being triggered. Doing the emotional work to educate. Right. As y'all are typing in, I wanna make a note because I'm seeing these themes come up from what you're sharing. You know, I always say my presentation talks about folks who have experienced marginalization. And I remind folk, there are no marginal people. People aren't marginal. People are marginalized by systems and structures. And a lot of times we engage with this conversation at an interpersonal level. But there's the critical importance of realizing that people who are experiencing marginalization and oppression are experiencing it at multiple areas and avenues of their lives. It is interpersonal, it's institutional, it's structural, it's cultural, it's institutional. And so we have to begin to explore our level of discomfort and recognize that what might be uncomfortable for us in a conversation, or maybe in a meeting or in a session, and think about how our ability to stay in our comfort zone is a space of occupying this level of privilege that folks who are experiencing marginalization do not have. It's about being continuously present through these different forms of inequities, through these forms of oppression. And our momentary discomfort is a teeny tiny portion to what people are living through each and every day of their lives. And not just in one aspect or avenue, not just in one lane of their lives, but compounding. And so I'm really glad that to see that folks are engaging with that honesty and transparency, y'all. Thank you for your transparency in here. I see some people putting into the chat as well. Thank you. Generational denial and moving the conversation to a different topic. Literally just changing the topic, right? The arguments of reverse racism. Listen, I think, you know, I wish we had more time because I want to get into what that means and how the idea or the construct of reverse racism, the person puts LOL at the end. So I'm assuming that, you know, it's getting to the point that racism is not reversible, certainly not easily. And to claim that it is would be to minimize the extensive and compounding nature of racism. And so perhaps we're on the, we're kind of alluding to that as well. Feeling as if your feelings or thoughts won't be understood, having to grow and facing that we're not perfect in our comfort zone. I'm so glad that you bring the term comfort zone. We're gonna get into that today. We always have space to grow. Not being able to fully open up in certain conversations. Someone shares privately that they got bullied for trying to engage in any way positively. They come from a family that's mixed, right? And this person identifies as a white person in a workplace can be a toxic atmosphere. Wow. Thank you all so much. I see so many other additional great comments in the Padlet. Wanting to help without stepping on the toes of those who are experiencing everything, right? Not knowing what whose lane is it. We're going to talk about that. High emotions. What are you doing? You're angry. It's happening right here, right now in your face, and you're angry. How do we engage with that? I believe that if we were taught the actual truth of our history, minds would be open. I agree. All right. So it sounds like this group in here is ready to talk about some things. And so I'm ready to get into it as well. Dealing with all of what you've mentioned and just maintaining professionalism, growth, and sanity. Yes. I wonder if, Alexis, if you have the title of the June session, if you could just put it in the chat if you have access to it, because I think that, you know, we're gonna, because we have just a half an hour together here now, we're gonna get into what is equity. And what I think is very clear is that diving deeply into these strategies about dealing with this compounded nature of oppression and how that impacts folks' wellness is so important, right? That allostatic load that someone shares when they say they've had to maintain professionalism and growth and their sanity. I honor that, and I'm glad that you bring that into the space. Yes, so the next session is going to be developing anti-racist strategies in behavioral health organizations. So let's get our grounding here in what equity is, and then hopefully folks can join or watch back on the next session where we're going to talk about implementing some of this understanding in equity to addressing racism. Okay. So this one's about how to have the conversation. And I like to be honest about having the conversation before we even get to it. There are different zones. There are different zones that folks can occupy. While these are our learning zones, and I like to use this as an example when it comes to equity work, one of my great colleagues at C4, and I process through this deeply about how these different zones play a role in equity work. And the first is our comfort zone. This is a place where we're familiar. It's easy. We might not even be all that motivated towards change in the space, but we're present. And there's times and spaces where our comfort zone is needed. But then if we really want to engage or grow or learn something, a lot of times folks suggest that the stretch zone is the place to be. The stretch zone is engaged, you lean in, you're excited, you're a little nervous. It's like, oh yeah, I'm getting something out of this. That's that stretch zone. A lot of people find that to be like the ideal spot. But then you have your panic zone. And I'm a warm welcomer of the panic zone, and I'll explain why. The panic zone is a place where people tend to feel overwhelmed or uncomfortable, possibly avoiding. And there are many reasons why. I want to acknowledge the different reasons why people could be experiencing the panic zone. And the first reason that I want to acknowledge that sometimes folks experience or go into their panic zone is because we're talking about something that is impacting you personally. Maybe we're talking about a difficult conversation and you've lived it and it's triggering for you. It's evoking some sense of unsafety. It's important to note when you go into that panic zone, particularly if you're in a heated discussion with someone about equity and they're talking to you and they're trying to debate humanity. That might not be a healthy space for you. And acknowledging that you're going into that panic zone might be a good indicator that you might need to step away for your wellness. But I also see another space in which panic zone happens. And that's when people just get really uncomfortable, and particularly in equity work. We'll start talking about really difficult concepts and conversations. In most of my trainings, I go through what is white dominant culture and how does it impact all of us. And I see some people begin to disengage. That might be going on the phone, it might be going over here, getting into a book, and people disengage because they feel uncomfortable. Having the critical awareness to know when that is happening is important in equity work, because that's the place where we need to sit and lean in. That's the discomfort that's going to help us move into a different space when it's coming to equity conversations. That's the place where we need to say, maybe I'm not receiving this well, but I need to write this down because this is something that I need to lean into and engage with a little bit further. Am I allowing my ability to separate from this conversation, to walk away from this conversation, to protect me from having to face the realities of other folks' lives? And am I allowing that protection to be a privilege of mine? And I typically go through privilege because I know that privilege is a term that doesn't always sit well with folks. But I like to remind folks that privileges are things that we should all have access to. Privileges are earned and unearned. They're identity-based and they're positionality-based. And so there are a lot of different ways, there's a lot of different literature around this conversation about privilege, but by not talking about it, we give it this incredible stigma that prohibits it from being something that we can utilize as a tool to assess our ability to engage in equity work. It's a powerful thing to identify in our equity work because it helps us to be able to understand the concepts. So we don't want to move away from it or to shut that down. These conversations are difficult, but they never have to be divisive. I want to also acknowledge that when you're engaging in critical dialogue around equity and resilience and recovery, you might go in and out of these zones. It's not like you're in one and you stay in one, you go in and out of them. And so it's important to be mindful of and observe our zones as we go through them. I also like to use a equity first framework. So when it comes to the conversations that I've been having in behavioral health organizations and recovery spaces, you know, it's really about, we need to diversify. We need to diversify. We need more diverse people. And when we get diverse folks in there, we're going to build in these programs and events to create inclusion. And then, you know, we can get to equity. And I want to propose a different framing of it. Not that there's something wrong with that way. I think that that's traditionally the way that we've thought about it. But I like to utilize an equity first framing. Equity is very challenging to get to, but it's not impossible. But usually, because it's the more challenging thing to do, we lend to put it on the back burner. We start responding to things that we perceive or see as more urgent first. But similar to how, you know, when you have something you really need to do, but it makes you uncomfortable, you don't want to deal with it, you kind of do everything else around the house first before you get to that big task. Equity has become that thing that we just, you know, do everything else around without addressing what's really at the hand. This is the hard work. This is the culture change work. This is the action work that says that when we are bringing in diverse people, when we are welcoming and creating all this space for diverse people, folks can feel included. And that's people being able to be included. Fair and just opportunity for the inclusion of all people is what equity, that's, you know, the simplified definition of equity. Now, what I've noticed is that a lot of people will talk about equity and equality. And so I think it's important to talk about the differences. But as I navigate through the rest of this presentation, I prioritize the equity first framework. That says, let's start with equity. Let's start with the critical self-work. Let's start with the discomfort. Let's start with understanding what the barriers are. And we'll talk about that in the next couple slides so that we can create inclusive spaces so that when diverse folk come and participate, they can feel welcome, that they don't have to experience struggle or hardship or be harmed when trying to occupy different spaces. How do we prioritize equity first? So this comes from this image, and there are many of them, right? Sometimes I'm not sure if I want to show these images because I feel like it quite oversimplifies things sometimes, but in addition to that, it doesn't have to, if we can lean into and examine what it is that the point that the images are trying to make. You've probably seen something similar, like with people standing on boxes, and these kinds of images show up all the time. This one was produced by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on their, they did a series on health equity. And, you know, in this first image on the top, you have this notion of equality, that everyone gets the same. Everyone gets treated the same, treat everyone equally, everyone the same, we should be good, right? Let's just see everyone the same. Let's just treat everyone the same. And then we won't have no more problem, no more issues. And equity is saying, equality is a goal, but we're not there yet. And in fact, in order for equality to be achieved, the gaps, the disparities, the historical and contemporary forms of disadvantage, of intentional and exploitive practices would have to be mended, addressed, and acknowledged in order for equality to even be possible. So equity is looking at responding to those disparities, responding to that differential treatment, responding to the systemic and structural oppression so that people can participate in a way that allows everyone to be able to be included. So the first image shows everyone getting the same thing. Everyone gets the same bike. But in the equity image, everyone gets something that allows them to participate in the same way. It allows everyone to be able to move toward the goal, but it's not the same because we need different things based on how society has treated us or other people have treated us or institutions or disparities that exist throughout our society. So I hope that the deeper level explanation gives more voice to this image and what the image is trying to articulate. Someone asked a really great question. How do you work with those who prefer to be divisive? Right? Support diversity. And so that's a really great question. And I think to start with that question and to kind of tie it into what we're doing is, well, we're going to be at different places. And sometimes what we find is the best strategy is just to engage with all people. And I mean, I even have people tell me, look, Ashley, we're ruining family dinners over these types of conversations. When you're at the point where you're working with someone or engaging with someone who prefers to have an equality-based mind frame and wants to dismiss the realities of systemic and structural oppression, then you reevaluate that conversation and reframe that conversation. I put it simply like this. I don't debate anybody over humanity. Once someone wants to have a divisive conversation with me that debates the humanity of another person, I stop the conversation and say, what type of entitlement allows us to even engage with this conversation? We need to stop and we need to look at our positionality to be able to have this conversation and the entitlement to be able to, create these types of arguments, right? And so that's about assessing, when we went through the request earlier, assessing where people are in their preparedness to engage and being willing to engage at that point. Absolutely. That's a great question. So equity stated just generally the most simple definition of it is fair and just opportunity for inclusion and access for all. Oh, but it's so much more complicated than that, right? Because in order to think about that, we have to ask, is that possible at this exact moment? We're going to do it equity way. Is that possible at this exact moment? What needs to change for that to be possible? That's the question that we can ask. That's the question we need. What needs to be changed for equity to occur? What can I do for equity to occur? And part of that conversation is also, how do I benefit from inequities? That's not the question that most of us like to ask ourselves. But a lot of times we enter this conversation and goes, that's so unfair. Oh, that's terrible that that's happening to those folks. I'm gonna stand in solidarity with them. That's how we approach it. But a paradigm shift is, how do I benefit from, contribute to, complicit, or am able to ignore the inequities that are occurring? What needs to change institutionally, organizationally, and in myself for equity to be possible? I'm going to chart a question. Very important question. So the first thing about equity, or one thing about equity rather, is that it requires action. Action entails acknowledging and removing obstacles to access. Notice how the first part of that is to acknowledge and removing. Because a lot of times we're still at the place where we don't even acknowledge that these barriers are existing. So what are some of the obstacles? Let's think about obstacles as it relates to recovery and folks' ability to thrive within recovery spaces. Systemic and structural racism. Removing obstacles to access. An obstacle is systemic and structural racism, discrimination, poverty, health access, housing disparities. Right, just to name a few, the list could go on. Identification of inequities. Systemic and structural oppression, systemic and structural racism is a huge term. You may say, well, how am I going to address systemic and structural racism? Well, how does it manifest within our organizations? How does it manifest within the role that I occupy or the spaces that I occupy? What are the discriminatory practices, the unstable housing? What are the compounding discrimination and exclusions that are existing that I may or may not be thinking about? Sometimes I like to describe privileges as also things that we don't have to think about. If you don't have to think about it, and you're not actively attempting to understand the complexities of inequities, then we might just be navigating without identifying them. We do not know that they exist. I use the term ignorant in the literal term, not knowing. I do not know that they're there, and I have not sought that out. Yep, someone shares that getting to equity might seem impossible, but when folks work together to make change at all levels, a little at a time, it can begin to happen. Commitment to change is a step toward equity. And the goal is to examine the conditions that fuel inequities with the goal to eradicate them, right? And I like to be really clear about what commitment to change looks like. This could be implementing policies and enacting laws. This could be a critical assessment of the role of white dominant culture recovery spaces and our complicity in it, our normalization of it. I like to talk a lot about institutional biases. And a lot of times institutional biases show up as, that's just the way it is. We've always done it this way. Okay. It might be contributing to the oppression of folk. And so we might need to look at some of those normal institutional biases to begin to shift them so we can make a commitment to change. But sometimes business as usual aligns with our identity. And so we don't have to think about it. We haven't identified the inequity, right? So a commitment to change means I need to understand what is considered normal in this space, what is considered to be the standard in this space, so that I can then challenge it. This could be assessing institutional practices. This could be assessing and auditing what are the different communication structures that the way that I communicate, or the communication structure of my organization. What are the different cultural values of the organization, of myself? And are my attempts to create equity or to engage in equity potentially performative diversification? Am I talking about equity because people want me, because I want people to think or know that I have a commitment to this, versus am I committing to equity and equity-based initiatives because I don't see another option, because it's critical to folks' survival, because people's mental health and wellness and physical wellness is at stake, because there's an urgency to the people's who have been enduring this for such a long time, and giving honor to the fact that the people who have been enduring it have been doing so with resilience and with grace, but that they should not have to. Process, reassess, and revise. So to ensure identification, design, and the implementation, anything that we're doing towards equity needs to include the narratives of the people who are experiencing the oppression. Are they included? Have they been part of the conversation? Are they leading the conversation? Am I asking myself the difficult conversation of, am I in the best space to be leading these initiatives, or should I be looking at potentially using my areas of power to restructure so that the voices of those folks who have lived this can be prioritized? These are some of the things that we think about when we're talking about equity. Okay. And we must be cautious that equity doesn't get minimized down. Equity is actionable. Equity is something we can do, all of us, right now. What are the different things that I could do continuously, day in and day out, to increase my awareness? And with that increased awareness, what different practices within my day, as in my work as a professional, can I actively change to reduce harm to people? How do I solidify those changes and begin to look at changing the norms and the cultures so that everyone can participate in ways that are authentic and genuine to them? How can I acknowledge the disparity that has existed and realize that me acknowledging it is in itself part of the process? Are we taking the time to listen to folk? A lot of times people say, well, Ashley, you know, we're doing really great equity work, but the perception of the community is just that we're rooted in this healthcare system, and that, you know, there's just this long legacy of people perceiving healthcare systems to be racist or you know, ageist, or some folks will say, you know, we have all these LGBTQIA programs, but, you know, people have heard these stories, and I don't know, we're doing all that we can. We are equitable. And I remind folks that people's perceptions is reality. We must continue to work on creating the norm that is equitable. Having one or two attempts to connect with people does not erase or could not replace the years and years of data, the historical trauma, the intergenerational knowledge that continues to impact over and over again the experiences of folk. And so that perception is real. That perception is, this happened to me. If it hasn't happened to me, it's happened to someone I know, a cousin, a loved one, a parent, or someone. I've been warned about this by my caregivers as I see it on TV, as I see it in the media. It wasn't me, but it was someone who looks like me, as I know for a fact that this happens and it occurs. And sometimes we miss the opportunity to allow that narrative, that perception, that reality to be at the forefront. Right? Absolutely. I see all the comments in the chat. Absolutely. I will certainly share my email at the end of the session, or if Alexis, you want to put it in the chat, you're more than welcome to. Yes, many institutions and practices acknowledge it in theory, but when it comes to putting it in practice, someone says in the chat, they don't see it. They don't see it. How do we move from it just being something that's said to something that's done? So in a lot of recovery spaces, some of the values lean to a space of neutrality. And it makes sense. But what we don't recognize is that when it comes to creating change for people who have been systemically and structurally marginalized, thank you, Alexis, for putting my email in the chat. When it comes to people who have been systemically and structurally oppressed, neutrality means nothing. It doesn't demonstrate a commitment to safety. It doesn't commit to change. It doesn't say, I acknowledge that your experience is different, unique, and complicated, and that it deserves a space to be examined with those complexities in mind. So when are we using neutrality for our own comfort? Because we don't know what to say, because we haven't taken the time to lean in more. One of my strategies that I usually tell people is we usually wait for someone to teach us. We wait for a resource list or a book club, and those things are great, don't get me wrong. But we also can go seek this information ourselves. And the reality of it is that we've only been told that there's a shortage of information or knowledge about people's marginalization, or the narratives of people who have experienced marginalization themselves. No, there's plenty out there. It just hasn't been prioritized. And so are we seeking out knowledge from people with lived experience? Is that something I actively do? So the suppression of narratives about how different communities historically and contemporary interact with various substances. Oops. You know, this one's particularly interesting because there's a lot of false narratives that exist. You know, we might get in some spaces where we'll have a real conversation about things like the war on drugs. And we might talk about, you know, disparities in sentencing. Absolutely needs to be talked about. But we make those points and then we go, and that's messed up. What we don't look at is all of the other compounding factors that those, you know, the criminality around substance use and disproportionality that that's had on communities of color, on Black and African American folk, and on communities with varying disabilities. The layered nuances of it. It's in that aspect of life, and it's in so many others. We don't talk about how substances have been used for different forms of control in different parts in history. And I'm getting close to my questions time, but I have a slide that'll get us to thinking about the importance of a historical approach. And then critical discussions on how systemic and structural oppression influence substance use. How there are dehumanizing policies, discriminatory practices, and how access to recovery resources are not equitable. And we'll look at this and we'll say, yeah, that's messed up. We really need someone to get on that. This is not the work for others. It is the work for us. And so I challenge folks to think about yourselves in the role of personal accountability. You all will have these slides. These notes here are adapted from the work of Dr. Ken Hardy. Some of it is developed through my own processing or utilization for training purposes and in these wonderful, amazing sessions that we have. But I want to just walk us through Dr. Ken Hardy's test of the privileged and subjugated. And I'm going to leave this as the last thing that we talk about because I want it to be that actionable piece for you all. I want this to be something that you can take away and start to do immediately. Something that you can pull out your notebook and write this down as something to begin to process right now. And then we'll go to QA. I actually don't see that many questions in the QA. but we'll go to QA. So please, if you have questions, please do submit them. Dr. Kinhardy first has these general tasks. These generic tasks are for everyone, acknowledging that everyone has privileged and subjugated identities. And I remind folk that there aren't subjugated folk, there aren't marginal folk. There are folk who have been marginalized by systems and structures, and the same is true about privileged and subjugated identities. So the generic tasks are to be expert of our own experiences, not of others, to create space for the tellings of one story, and to make space for both thoughts and feelings. Typically, we don't do both thoughts and feelings. So then Dr. Hardy presents the tasks of the privileged, and these are the tasks of the privileged, and I'll actually add one too, because I like to take creative autonomy there. So the task of the privileged is to resist the false notion of equality. It is not helpful to equate suffering, and sometimes this looks like an attempt at empathy. I'm going to connect with the part of me that understands and connects to the part of you. And I'm going to say, yeah, I did this. I know someone else I know. Resist the false notion of equality. It's not helpful to equate suffering. It's and both. Leaving space for people's truths to be told. Intentions versus consequences. To understand that your intentions might be good, but that does not change the fact that the consequences are bad. And so to take accountability is a critical part. To challenge a historical approach. Ashley, I didn't have anything to do with the horrible, horrible acts of violence against marginalized communities. And if we just stop talking about it, no. We have to challenge a historical approach. History definitely does matter. In fact, any new study on epigenetics and the transmission of narratives and protective mechanisms, appropriate adaptation will show us how important history is. But more so than that, the things that we are considering to be historical are actually very much still very contemporary. So history does matter. The past does affect the present, and the privileged cannot understand the subjugated experience outside of the context. To be consistent, we talked about this earlier. To not give up on connections with people who have been subjugated, even if we're initially rebuffed, even if they say, hey, I've been doing this program here at my organization for XYZ amount of months, and people just aren't coming. It's not that we're not doing it. We need to be just as consistent as the oppression, just as consistent for people to be able to have trust that we are really committing to equity is consistent. And to not be a framer of others' experiences, which is really hard to do because a lot of times we like to share other people's words. And, I like to the phrase, be the voice of the voiceless. But aside from that being an ableist word in itself, people just aren't being listened to. And the question is why? And if we're framing other people's experiences, are we buying into the idea that is better heard from someone else than the people who are living it and experiencing it themselves? And then I said that I wanted to add one, and the one that I'll add is to relinquish the expectation for people to make us comfortable when they're telling their truth. Expectation to be made comfortable, even when we've caused harm. Finally, and this is my last slide, the tasks of the subjugated. The tasks of the subjugated, my friends, is to overcome this learned silencing, to advocate for oneself, to challenge the belief that's not worth speaking up. The silence is golden. Don't speak unless you're spoken to unlearn this behavior, to learn to exhale the negative messages that have become internalized. People really struggle with this. To overcome the impulse to protect, educate, and change the privileged. To overcome the impulse to protect it. As soon as things get to uncomfortable, what happens? People go, oh, it's okay. I don't. Overcome the impulse to protect, educate, or change the privileged. And just engage where people are at. And then to deal with one's own rage. Someone wrote earlier about being angry. Rage is a word that kind of trips people up sometimes, but it's anger. And when it says to challenge it appropriately, it doesn't mean don't be angry. Don't not feel it. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is that a lot of times that anger becomes internalized. That anger comes home with us. We wish we would have said, we should have said, we've internalized it. And then we leave it for ourselves to be unresolved. If we're feeling angry about something, that means that something needs to be addressed, something needs to be said. How do we channel it and make sure that that thing is said or done? How do we make sure that we're creating the space for that voice, that narrative, that story to be told? How do we make sure that we're creating space for feelings to be present when people have been harmed, to channel it appropriately, not to internalize it? While shame is a major stumbling block for the privileged, anger that is turned internal is a stumbling block for those who have experienced subjugation. And so I ask that you all, as you leave this session today, think about the tasks of the privileged. Think about the tasks of the subjugated. What resonates with you from both lists? And which one can you begin to immediately address so that you can have conversations, critical conversations about moving toward equity? So we no longer have to make different excuses as to how we're not going to start or when we're going to start, but so that we can just begin. Acknowledging that equity is action and that it's more than just going, wow, that was good conversation. Okay, I'm gonna go make myself a sandwich. It's gotta start. And so I see that there are 2 questions in the QA, but I welcome folks with our next 10 minutes or so. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. You can put them in the QA. Either way, I'll see them. So someone says, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Alexis.
I just want to say thank you. And yes, just as you did, to encourage those who have questions to please go ahead and drop those in, because I am so excited that we have you today and then we have you again on June 9th. So let's continue this very important conversation. As you said, it's a journey. So let's dive in here with our questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. I'm so glad to be here today. Oh, me too, Samantha. Yes, thank you. I see your comments in the chat. I won't read the names of the ones that come just to panelists, but thank you. So should we strive, someone asks, to reach for equity? Or should we strive for equity to reach diversity? Great question. Should we strive for equity to reach diversity? Well, yes. I think we should always strive for equity. And I think that that's such an important question, because a lot of times what we do is we strive for diversity first. And I've seen it happen so many times where we have these great, amazing, diverse staff members, and then people can't participate equally. They're harmed. They're coming into work, or they're coming into the organization, or they're coming to receive services, and we've recruited and brought in all these diverse people, and we're not prepared to honor the uniqueness of their experience. And so we just continue to perpetuate harm. You know, it's like bringing people in to say, oh, well, we're not quite set up and ready for you yet. You can't participate fully. But you're here, so why don't you make it happen for us? Right? And so striving to respond to equity, to say, okay, we're welcoming these folks in, but we don't have non-binary bathrooms, so folks can't even use the restroom, right? Like, are you thinking about equity first? We don't have a policy around anti-Black racism, but we're welcoming in all these Black and brown folk to our organization. So how do we think about equity first, so that when we are bringing in diverse folks, they have an ability to be able to participate without harm? Do you hold conversations with public health departments on health equity, conversations around inequities? Absolutely. Yeah, I've been so, I'm so grateful that I get to have these conversations in so many spaces and with groups of folks who I never would have imagined we're going to be engaging with. But people are so the answer to that question briefly is yes, right? And I look forward to hearing from you. And also a lot of times people will ask me, well, why now? Why now? These issues, let's be clear, these issues are not new. They're not new at all. The information's not new. It's not new at all either. People have been saying these things and fighting for these issues, and this topic's not new. The disparity that people are experiencing is not new. And so I've been asked, like, why now? And one, there's a lot of different type of resources that are being provided to look at these issues. A lot of systemic and structural issues have put this on the forefront of people's minds. And while there would have been a lot of other great times to address it, I also want to acknowledge that many people are realizing that they've missed those opportunities and are trying to make up for that by addressing it now. And so I feel that we engage with it, we lean into it, we go there, we have those conversations, but we also honor the many, many folks who have come before who have tried to have these conversations by not letting it just be a conversation. We do something with it. We have these conversations and then we change a policy. We change an administrative practice. We change the way that we respond. So I think why now is because we're moving into this space where it's okay. We're honoring that people have been saying this for so long, and now we're going to see what we can do. And I think it's the accountability of all of us to ensure that it's not just another conversation. Yep. Someone put into the chat, right, that they've been around, but we're more open about the issues. Yeah. I have recognized my privilege. This is a question in the chat. I have recognized my privilege in the form of wealth recently. As a person-to-person, our person-to-person's reparations ever a short-term solution while we wait for federal government to recognize their need? If this is a viable solution, how do you recommend setting that up? That's a really great question. And I feel like if the person who wrote that question wants to reach out, I think it's a very important question. And I have a lot of thoughts, but certainly more than 3 minutes worth of thoughts about what that looks like. And it depends. So when it comes to privilege, and particularly wealth privilege, there's a lot that folks can do. And one of the things that has been noted as we look at equity and equity scholarship is that sometimes folks will utilize different forms of wealth privilege in a way that is anti-oppressive, and that gives back with the acknowledgement of where that wealth disparity originates from. There's a lot of different ways where people support organizations or support individuals, support the work that's happening, or to begin to eradicate some of the disparity that exists. So there are a lot of different ways that folks can utilize their wealth privilege to begin to resolve some of the systemic and structural issues, but while also acknowledging how one has received that type of wealth disparity. And there's the other part of it as well, is that when it comes to philanthropic work or giving or reparation-based work, is that sometimes, because of the way that it's managed or mismanaged, it can sometimes be used as a form of control. I'll give you this, but only if. And so a big part of it is helping people, helping your organization or whatever that is, process through how to do that in an anti-oppressive way, in a way that's genuinely committed to having that be used to reduce harm, as opposed to something that will continue to put limitations on folks' liberation. And so I think that that's an important question. I do know and have seen that done very, very profoundly in a lot of different ways, and would be happy to talk about it. But it really is also important that when folks are thinking about how to, which absolutely I encourage, how to do it in an anti-oppressive way, how to do it in a way that's going to really lead to that ongoing sustainable change. It's going to be transformative and healing. How to do it in a way that demonstrates authenticity and doesn't minimize the complicated grief that stands behind the privilege in the first place. So absolutely, and glad to know that folks are thinking about that. Other questions? We got a whole minute left.
Oh, I'm sure we could ask questions for days and how important that is. Dr. Stewart, thank you so very much for leading us through these very important and not always easy to answer questions today. I am excited that we'll be able to welcome you back on June 9th. Like I said, that is developing anti-racism strategies in behavioral health agencies. And so I love that you have given us all some homework to think on, reflect on, maybe start having some of those difficult conversations ourselves so that we can regroup again when you join us next time. On behalf of all of us at Northwest Mhttc, thank you very much. Please do remember to take our evaluation so we can capture your feedback to help us plan for our next sessions. And as always, you can go to our website and sign up for a newsletter to stay informed about Dr. Stewart's events and all of our other trainings and services that we offer. So everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you again hopefully on June 9th. Thanks so much.